It's very important, first of all, to understand what our clients do, what the guests do, because that's why we have to do a lot of research. I think the best guests are who are willing to share their stories, because your podcast is also about storytelling. So to share their stories, to be open, to be vulnerable, and just to be happy to share all their experience.
You see, another important thing I think maybe people need to realize is that it's not always easy. If you are looking for success, it takes a lot of hard work. Nothing can trump hard work. Hard work is very, very important. So, you might know all the strategy, all the tips and tricks out there, but if you don't put in the work, you are never going to go anywhere.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. So true. And also that, and people downplay this hard work part so many times nowadays. You just have to work smart and you'll be rich and whatever. No, it doesn't work like that. Even if you ask Gary Vee, I mean, he's quite famous about this, and you have to put the hard work in. You have to. So my name is Noemi Beres, and I live in Cyprus in Europe. I was born and raised originally in Hungary in Central Europe, but moved here to this beautiful country 13 years ago. And I run a podcast booking agency with my husband. It's called Podcast Connections. And I became an entrepreneur in 2007. And I didn't know what I'm getting myself into because becoming an entrepreneur is a very long journey. And it was really interesting. But that time when I became an entrepreneur, we lived in Ireland for 7 years. And that was the place where we started our own business. We started an online travel-related business back in 2007. And we did we were the first car rental brokers for Hungarian customers. So it was a really interesting job. I did a lot of social media marketing, content creation, blogging, travel writing. So it was just a really interesting time. But then unfortunately, COVID hit in 2020. So we had to pivot. And luckily, we had another option. So that was it when we became podcast booking agents. And we started to run our own podcast booking agency here in Cyprus. And we've been doing this now. This is our 5th year in the business, and it's running very well. And it's a great time to be in this industry because it's booming. It's a very interesting time to do that because everybody almost has a podcast, or if they don't have one, they will start one. So it's kind of a booming industry right now. I lived in a small town, so the place had a kind of small town mentality, kind of narrow-minded community, I can say that. So I always wanted to travel and I always wanted to discover the world. So when I was about even just 10 years old or something like that, so I told my parents, I definitely want to get away from this place. And they were a bit surprised, but they understood me. So when I turned 16, I became an exchange student, and I went to study to Denmark for a year. And it was an eye-opening experience for me because not just that I lived in a different culture, in a different place in Europe, but I also learned a completely new language. And I learned so much about myself and about the world, how to be more independent at age 16, 17. So it's really helped me to become me, the person as I am today. So I think it's a great opportunity. Travel, learning new cultures, even at a young age, is so important for us because it really helps us to, just to discover the world and even become entrepreneurs later on.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Traveling, they say, is part of education. Then, as you leave your country to other parts of the world, try to explore the world, as you will call it. You usually will take a part of you. That is what we are talking about often here in Obehi Podcast, because we are talking to people of African descent, people who are not in Africa, but they know that they are from Africa. So, in this article, it makes sense to us that we usually will make reference to where we are coming from, our culture, and all of that. So, in that light, what would you say you take along with you as you journey into the rest of the world? That can be very important for somebody to learn.
That's a great question. Thank you for that. Yeah, first of all, the language and the culture. I mean, I moved away 20 years ago, but I mean, deep down in my heart and my soul, I am Hungarian. So probably you can see behind me that I have these collages that I make. And for example, I'm also an artist. So all these collages really kind of an homage to my heritage, because we all have roots, and these roots are in the country where we were born, obviously. And my son was born in Hungary too. So it's important to kind of, take this culture, take this language with us, and still appreciate it, because it's part of our identity. So it's really important to keep that, especially in this world when people are moving around in different countries. But like deep down, you are still Hungarian. So you have to take that kind of heritage with you. And I think that's the most important part. So when we should never forget where we come from, even if it was a small town. It's very important, first of all, to understand what our clients do, what the guests do, because that's why we have to do a lot of research in order to place them on the right show, because there are like 3.5 million podcasts out there. So you really have to work on that and to find the right mix and match if it comes to podcasts. And I think the best guests are who are willing to share their stories, because your podcast is also about storytelling. So to share their stories, to be open, to be vulnerable, and just to be happy to share all their experience during podcast interviews. I think that's the most important thing. If they're not willing to do that, if they only want to just talk business and promote their business, that kind of stops them to really align with the audience. But once you share your story, like I shared now, that where I came from, what I did in my life, people will align you, the audience, the listeners will align you so much better and so much easier than if you're just, selling your product, or this is the book I wrote, this is the service I provide. So you really have to give value on the shows in order to people to trust you and really listen to you, because there are hundreds and thousands of podcast interviews out there. But in order people to really find you interesting, you have to share yourself with the world and share things that you usually don't share with people, and kind of open up. I think that's really important for a guest, and also for a host. And from the host point of view, it's like they learn to listen, because that's just so important when you are a host, and to give space for the other person to share the story. And first of all, people need to hear your voice. I need to hear your story. So that's really important. And the other thing is that, podcasts can really support your business. Although I know that a lot of hosts are struggling with actually making money from podcasts, but there's always a way to make money of the podcast. It can support your coaching program. It can support your business if you do it the right way. And I have a podcast host friend. He's from the UK. He's in the e-commerce world, and he told me once that sometimes, he wanted to get on a discovery call with someone, and as a potential client, but they usually refused him. It's like, no, I don't want that call, and this and that. They always had excuses about that. But then when he started his own podcast, and now he has like 5-6 different podcasts, but he started his first podcast, and he invited them on the show and asked them, it's like, okay, so what about if you get on my show and I interview you? People say so much easier yes to a podcast interview than to a discovery call or a business call. It's a huge difference, because everybody has obviously an ego, and everybody loves to talk about themselves. So it's a great way to connect. It's so much easier to connect. And in my opinion, podcast guesting and even running a podcast both ways, doesn't matter which side of the mic you sit, it's still the best way to do networking in the 21st century, because you get to know the other person, not just a face on LinkedIn or not just a small message, but you already had a conversation, you already started a conversation, and then from that you can start a business relationship, a friendship. There's so many opportunities out there if you do it the right way. So I think it's the 21st century's best business networking opportunity if you get on shows and if you talk to people and if you host a show.
Podcast is an incredible opportunity for today. Of course, you made mention of LinkedIn being the best tools out there for entrepreneurs to use in this time that we are living in. You have the time to be able to explain what you are doing through podcasting. You are able to build one-on-one, a one-on-one rapport with this individual, which can really be very powerful when you look at it from the point of view of business. But sometimes people might be wondering what is actually the best way to do that. So what do you say from that point of view, since you work with a lot of people within the area of podcasting and, of course, branding and communication? Of course, all these are part of the conversation.
It's a problem right now. And I hear that from so many people that how to do this, how to do that. But the best way, I think, it's, as mentioned before, you basically invite your potential clients and you build rapport, as you said, during conversations. That's one of the reasons. You also create content. And content is still king. And with content creation, you're building your brand, you're building your authority as a podcast guest, as a podcast host. And this is really important if you want to do business, because people recognize your name, people recognize your brand. Oh, that's the woman, that's the guy who has a podcast. And I heard about this and I heard about that. I trust them. I trust them more if I am just promoting a product maybe on Facebook or an Instagram ad. So that's why podcast marketing is so powerful. Although it's a long-term strategy, but it really works for so many people on the planet right now. You have to practice it and you have to start small. So when you decide that you want to be a podcast guest, try to find podcasts that are really aligned with your message and aligned with your business. Think about, go through in your mind. So what kind of podcast I want to be a guest on? Where are my potential clients or listeners are? And you need to do a lot of research. That's why people hire us, because research takes time. So you can actually cut that time off if you have, if you hire a podcast booking agency, because you need to find those podcasts that align with your message, align with your business. And once you find those, you really need to focus on yourself and craft your bio, craft your story, craft your topics, your talking points. I always tell people not to wing it, because you come always prepared. I think that this is really important, to come prepared to a podcast, to listen to a few episodes when you get on the show, because if you know more about the host, if you know more about the show, then you become a better guest. Also, try to be engaging and try to treat a podcast interview as a friendly conversation between two people, because it's not just you saying a monologue, but it's back and forth. It's, there's ebb and flow. There's a nice balance between the host and the guest. So always speak clearly and with enthusiasm, and try to be conversational rather than just firm and stiff during the conversation. I think that's really important. And also be respectful, because the host gives you a space where you can share your story, your knowledge. You can also share, what kind of business you do, but don't treat the podcast as just a promotional material, or because it's not about that. It's about sharing stories. It's about sharing knowledge. So be respectful and think about that. And also, be punctual and get ready emotionally when you are on a show, and don't always just, book podcasts back to back, because it can be really tiring, and people and the listeners will feel it when you are bored on a show or when you are overtired. So I think it's really important to be present when you're a guest. Be present, be engaging, be happy to be part of a conversation. First of all, I need to know a lot about the specific podcast. They need to tell me what is their podcast about, what they are passionate about. And I think the most important question is who's your ideal guest is. because and we need to clear about that, what they want on their show, what kind of people they want on their show, and also who their listeners are. Who is your listener? As a podcast host, you also need to be clear about who is your listener, who your listeners are, because sometimes it's not easy to find it out because you're not getting all this feedback all the time from listeners. But you need these two questions. So who's your ideal guest, and where your listeners come from? What are they interested in? So these are the first questions I would ask from them.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. It is very important that we listen to the audience, those that you are talking to. Now, I have a curiosity. There is this argument that come out quite often within the podcasting industry, which is the length of the podcast, the length of the episode. So what can you say about that?
The length of the episode, I think, it's like an average, which should be around 40 minutes, but no longer than that. So, because sometimes, and most of the time, people just don't pay attention. And if the podcasts are too long, if they, go over for an hour or even longer. So I think the sweet spot is somewhere between 30 minutes, 45 minutes. That's a great place to specify the length of a podcast. Not too long, not too short, but it's still enough for a decent conversation. There's no right or wrong when you do podcasts. Like I know that the Diary of a CEO, a podcast can be really long too. And I listen to like long podcasts as well, because sometimes when they have celebrity guests and they go on, for over 1 hour, 2 hours. So I wouldn't say it's wrong. It's just an average people we just listen to podcasts, and we don't have that much time to listen to podcasts all the time. So probably just easier to focus on like a 30-40 minutes episode compared to a 2 hours or 3 hours long conversation. But also when it's a video, I think it can be really entertaining to watch that, and if you have a longer episode. So it really depends. I mean, if it's a good podcast and what they cover during the show, it's important. I think it can be as long as 3 hours. So there's no right or wrong here. That's my take on it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. What you're saying make a lot of sense. Now, this is my point here. I think maybe sometime where the people listen might contribute to the relevance of the length of the podcast or the episode in the podcast. Now, in the sense that one thing is to maybe listen to an episode, maybe when you are driving, another way, maybe you are listening to it, you are doing something, you just sort of disconnect your head, then you concentrate on what you are doing, but you are feeding yourself with information, and it can even sort of help you to do your things quite easily. So I would like you to say something about what do you know, or what should we know about where people are listening to podcasting? Because podcasting is different from video now, in the sense that if you are listening to a YouTube video, you need to see what you are listening to. But if you are listening to a podcast now, you don't necessarily need to see it, which can even be very beneficial for you as a business owner if you want to bake ad into what you are doing. So what do you say about that?
Yeah, where do they listen? They usually, I would say, in my opinion, most of us, we still listen on Apple Podcast. And what I noticed that, for example, in Europe, I personally, specifically, I learn a lot of podcasts on Spotify, because when I'm on the go, when I'm traveling, I can just download podcasts on my phone and I can just listen to them straight away. But for example, Spotify works very well for me. Not so much Apple Podcast on iPhone. I don't know why. It's really interesting. But and when you are at home and you watch a podcast, obviously there's YouTube. But when you are on the go and when you travel and when you drive, or like 3-4 hours or something like that, probably I would say Spotify and Apple Podcast. Those are the best places. But when you are at home and for example, you really want to watch the episode, because it's more and more podcast hosts recording video too, which is also important, because it kind of adds to the quality of the conversation and people can see faces. So most of us, I would say, watch interviews at home on their computers. But of course, obviously, you can do that on your phone as well. But I think it's just a better experience if you do the YouTube at home on your computer. It's just bigger. But Spotify, Apple Podcasts for sure. Yeah, it can be longer for sure when you listen to it. So because I do a lot of cooking as well, for my family. And when I cook, I listen to podcasts. And time flies because, as you said, your brain just switches off and you can purely concentrate on the show, and you can do everything else around that. So it doesn't matter. So I can easily consume longer podcasts, audio podcasts, when they are, in my ears, and I can just focus on that. I think, yeah, absolutely. Longer conversations just work so much better when you just listen to them and not just focusing and watching. But because, as you said, usually people don't have time to sit in front of a computer for 3 hours and watch an interview. So yeah, domestic work, running, whatever, jogging, doing exercise, you can totally consume longer content. And then that's why you can consume audiobooks so much, because you do something in the meantime, but your brain can totally switch off and you can totally concentrate on the content that you are listening, even if it's longer. Obviously, ad space, and if you have sponsors, they support your show. And as you said, you were absolutely right, because you can't really speed it up or whatever. It's not like YouTube when you watch the ads. So it's kind of part of the conversation. So you really just stick to it and you listen to that part too. So that's why you have an opportunity to sell other people's product. Or even if you're a podcast host and you offer a service or you wrote a book, you can totally include that in the conversation. Because I had a conversation with a podcast host last week. And she told me that do you use your podcast to advertise your own business? And when she asked this question from her clients, they usually say, no, I don't. So it's a good place to actually even advertise your own product, your own service, your own book, because people will listen to it, will digest that information why in between the conversation or before or after. So it really depends, but it definitely works. It works for so many people. I think the challenge is to keep up and being consistent and persistent with the shows, because podcast hosting seems like a brilliant idea until you find out that actually it takes a lot of time and effort and money to create one single episode. Because some people think, I just sit down and record the episode and everything is going to be fine and I just post it. But actually it involves a lot of work, time, money, and energy. And most of the people are not clear about this. So that's why I realized that the magic number when it comes to podcasts, it's about now episode 6. Usually the podcast, they stop at episode 6 if they are not so serious about the whole business or just running a podcast, because they just realize that this is a lot of work and I have to put so much energy into it. So the ones actually are successful, the ones that actually can be consistent and persistent with creating content week by week, after month by month, or year by year. You just have to work it, and you just have to rinse and repeat and keep doing it. Otherwise you won't create content. So I think that's like people want, like in everything else and in business too nowadays, everybody wants to be successful, overnight. And this is not happening. And this is exactly the case with podcasts too, because yes, you recorded 10 episodes, 20 episodes, and no, you won't be John Rogan or Amy Porterfield next day or 2 weeks later. You need to be persistent. You need to be consistent creating that content. And also, if you can afford, you can definitely outsource the work. So you don't do everything all by yourself, like editing and images and promotion. So you need to have a group of people in order to build a community around it to be successful, to be a successful podcast host.
You need a lot to make it successful, and that cannot be said better than that. Thank you so much for pointing that out. You see, another important thing I think maybe people need to realize is that it's not always easy. If you are looking for success, it takes a lot of hard work. Nothing can trump hard work. Hard work is very, very important. So, you might know all the strategy, all the tips and tricks out there, but if you don't put in the work, you are never going to go anywhere.
Yes, I agree with you 100%. So true. And also that, and people downplay this hard work part so many times nowadays. Like you just have to work smart and you'll be rich and whatever. No, it doesn't work like that. Even if you ask Gary Vee, he's quite famous about this, and you have to put the hard work in. You have to put into those hours to succeed. And I'm just not talking about podcasts, but I'm in business general. And it's not just about 4-hour work week at the beginning. So you really just put into that work. And you may end up, doing that 4-hour work week if you are if you have a team and a support network, and you can do it wisely. But everybody started to put the hard work into whatever they did, and it's not from day one and like, okay, yeah, I just worked 4 hours, like, yeah, for a week. Yeah, you won't be succeeding anytime soon, for sure. It's a booming industry, and I love that about it. And I can see that it's becoming more of a more platform for everyone. Like, I was on a podcast interview, and the host asked me a question of like, oh, did I notice that how much of an important part played podcast, for example, in the election in the US, because all the politicians started to use podcasts for their own advantages. So I think more people notices this is for celebrities, for politicians. So it's getting more and more importance in the world, because first everybody just thought that like, oh, I just share my thoughts on podcasts. But everybody is just, I think, realizing now that the thoughts and things you share on podcasts, they have a power over people, because so many people listen to it. And more people listen to it than watching news or watching TV or listening to radio, because it's a free platform. You can say whatever you want. It's not restricted to anything. So people will stick to this platform, because while TV shows or radio shows might be restricted to say certain things, on a podcast, you can share anything and everything. It doesn't matter. That's why people love it, because you can share everything openly, and you can there's a podcast for everything, for all topic. So people will never run out of topics. So you can just go listen to any podcast. You can do true crime. You can do about science. You can do, about politics, art, history. There's a podcast for everything. So once I heard this quote about it, it's that podcasts are the new Netflix of the 21st century, because it's even more interesting to watch them than sometimes movies or TV shows. So yeah, I think it still has a very, very bright future, and they will be around for many, many years.
Oh, right. Thank you so much, Noemi. Thank you so much for the time that you have spent here talking about what you do and how you help people in your business. Now, I'd like us to go back to where we are coming from now, your country, your beautiful country. What do you want people to learn about that? Give people the reason to visit that place again, because of course that is a beautiful aspect of our existence. We know where we are coming from, and we also want people to feel it. So sell your country for us in a few seconds. Let people know what they should look up to visiting your country of origin.
Love it. Yeah, it's a beautiful country in the middle of Europe, especially Budapest. There are a lot of tourists who are just visiting, for history, for culture, for food. The Hungarian cuisine is very tasty, and many people like that. So if you love culture, history, if you like nice food and nice cakes, we have beautiful cakes in Hungary, all kind of different cakes. So come to Hungary. I did a bit of like touristy things during Christmas time, and it was so much fun to kind of rediscover Budapest, the capital. And it was really nice to just see the city through a tourist eye. Although I am Hungarian, but there's always things to discover, even if you're from there. And I haven't lived there for 20 years, so it's really nice to go back. And I always go back like every 3-4 months to visit my mom. But it's always nice to just, see the city, see the country through like a tourist eye. So you discover all these brilliant things about it.
All right. So with that, what do you want people to learn about your business? There are people there who want to connect with you. So let them know how they can reach out to you and what they can benefit by reaching out to you. So go ahead and tell people about your business.
Yeah, in a nutshell. So the name of our business is Podcast Connections, and we help entrepreneurs, business owners, coaches to get on quality podcast shows and enrich their life through connections, and help to share their stories, help to share their knowledge. So that's what our business does in a nutshell. We also provide our clients with a done-for-you service. So we organize everything and save them time, money, and energy when they work with us, because they don't have to do the hard work, the legwork. We do that for them. They just have to appear on the show and share the story, share the knowledge. And they can find us by visiting our website, which is podcastconnections.co. And you can also find me on LinkedIn. I love LinkedIn. I'm also very active on it. That's how we connected, which is a great place. And so if you type my name in, Noemi Beres, you will find me there. There's a tiny microphone sign next to my name, and I'm happy to connect and have a chat.
Thank you so much, Noemi. You are so wonderful. You are so wonderful. I really appreciate the time that you spend here talking to me and sharing some tips and strategy on how to be successful as a podcaster and also as business people who want to leverage the power of podcasting in their business. So I really appreciate the time that you spend here. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And of course, I look forward to you coming back again so we can have more conversation about podcasting and business. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this lovely conversation. I really, really enjoyed it.